Hey guys, and welcome back to another episode of the Renaissance Room podcast. And in today's episode, we are going to be talking about the very superficial dynamics of femininity and masculinity. And I know this is a popular one, so I'll be sure to capture this podcast episode and entitle it in such a way that we don't bring out our gender war werewolves, because that's just not the energy that I'm trying to bring here for this podcast episode. I want to talk about it from an environmental standpoint. I want to talk about it structurally, right? And we are going to be talking about it in terms of Black women. All right. Y'all know I'm a sister. Okay. So let's go ahead and get into the episode. So I was thinking about this in regards to my own dynamic, right? My mother, very feminine woman. My mother is a Black woman. And when we think about femininity, we know in its origins and its context, it has always kind of been deemed as a white woman's thing, right? And we know just the historical context behind that. We know the degradation of Black women, our bodies, our femininity, and all the things. So where I am right now is I'm just kind of in the space now where I'm really just starting to assess the realities, right? You meet people who see your Black body as a Black woman and they automatically project that you are not feminine, right? If you're assertive, they misinterpret that, right? And so even if it's just in a tone of your voice, right? We obviously know that white women's voices, Black women's voices, Black men's voices, our voices sound different. And it's not just because we're Black. It's because it's a cultural difference, right? And so, if you're Indian, if you're speaking to someone from, Bangladesh, they're going to sound different than a white person, right? So it's not necessarily like a Black and white thing, right? It's not a race thing. It's just a cultural thing. And that's another thing we don't typically acknowledge within American society because of racism and white supremacy, right? We don't acknowledge the fact that Black people have their own culture, right? And our voices sound different. And so when people start to kind of divvy, like they always have, right? Always up in Black people's business, they start to say things like, Black women aren't feminine, Black women are aggressive, blah, 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 right? And all of these things are misinterpretations of our identity, right? Our sense of belonging, and who we really are as women, right? And reason why there's this huge misrepresentation is because most people, and prior to social media, right? Most people were not really privy to Black women in Black culture in the same way that they are today, right? Now it's kind of becoming this thing where people are all up in Black people's business, right? There's this thing that people are doing right now on Instagram and TikTok where there's a trend where white people are saying, if I was a wigga, right? And I honestly, for me, I was so taken back from that, I had to just delete the app and sign off. And mind you, I was on a backup page because I'm not even on Instagram, but when I have to find a local hairdresser and I want to see their work, you know what I mean? I have to get online because I got to make sure that I'm, booking accordingly, right? So it's sometimes I'll, get on social media to connect if I want to see if the new matcha shop is opening up in the city, that's what I use Instagram for. But sometimes I'll find myself scrolling, and as I'm scrolling, I just so happen to come across cultural trends and things that people are doing today that are just not okay. So that's something that's just a huge red flag. But anyway, I want to remind y'all of just a few years ago, right? We don't even have to take it back to the 90s, right? 2026, 2018, Black men and Black women, was there always sort of this cultural, by and large, right? These conversations about Black men and Black women and the drama? Yes. But by and large, we were absolutely in cahoots with one another. We were doing just fine. I didn't have any problems dating as a young 20-somethings, early 20-somethings, right? College girl. I had no problem dating. I didn't have a problem meeting men, right? There was not all this talk about money and high value and worth and all these different things. We just kind of got to know one another. We were Black, right? The attraction was there. And culturally, we were not as divided as genders. And I know that sounds contrary to belief because we've always heard from the mainstream media, which is continuously pushing this narrative that Black women and Black men are at odds, but it's not true. And I'm here to tell you that it's not true, right? I've seen my aunties, my cousins, everybody had a man, everybody was dating, and we were all pretty much content with our relationships, right? So this is not about settling. And I don't want anybody to oversimplify what it is that I'm saying. This wasn't that these women were settling, that, they were okay with their man not having money. No, it just was more so we were in community with one another as Black people, and that didn't really need to be dissected or to be discussed, right? Period. And there was a sense of respect and a sense of admiration that a lot of Black men had for Black women, whether it was our weaves, our nails. I know y'all probably don't believe this, and some of y'all on here might be a little too young, but there was a point in time where Black men absolutely love Black women and everything that came with us. And I know you got the Beckys in the background. They're trying to get their booties up and they're trying to do all these things. But there was a point in time where if a Black man was proudly dating a white woman, and if it wasn't like a high school relationship, we were all kind of looking at you like interesting. You know what I mean? We weren't racist per se, but we also weren't like on the wave of like, you know what I mean? He wasn't a reject. He wasn't a reject. She wasn't a reject, but they were different. Right? It wasn't a cultural norm for us to date outside of our race. It's such large numbers. It wasn't a popularity thing, right? It wasn't something that we used to sort of like put ourselves in situations to be upwardly mobile, right? It wasn't a thing that we used for social capital. All of that right there is just new. This is all new, and I want you guys to know that. So I think it's important that we give context, right? So anyway, I'm sitting here thinking about femininity. And like I said, growing up, I would say my mother was a very feminine woman. That doesn't mean that she did not, participate and enjoy her life and, all these different things. No, but by and large, my mother was a very feminine woman. And it was really just how I felt she carried herself and how she moved. And she just was very loving and very soft and very nurturing. And she still is to this day, right? But today, she wouldn't be considered feminine, right? And it's not that my mother inherently has changed, right? It's that the environment around her has changed. And so I want to talk a little bit about what happens when our external environments are not safe, okay? So when I think about my own sense of displacement in terms of my femininity, right? I definitely felt like growing up, when I had girlfriends, when, I was in high school, college, it was easier to make friends. Black people were more in community together, right? There wasn't all this gentrification. There wasn't the continuous gun violence, which we do. At some point, we might want to talk about where are the kids getting the guns from, I don't know, that whole thing with Reagan and the crack, I don't know. I think we might want to kind of sit to just think a little bit more critically about where the kids are getting the guns from, right? So anyway, gun violence was always a thing, yes, but by and large, you didn't hear about it on a regular basis, right? Like people were not killing their partners, right? People were not killing their families. They were not murdering their wives. 14-year-olds were not getting shot. 16-year-olds, it was just not by and large, it's always been a thing, yes, but not by and large, not a commonality, right? And that's not something that we're hearing about every other day. And so we talk about it a lot on this podcast, right? And you guys know that, social media has absolutely had a very negative impact on our mental health. And so a lot of people are not well. And when you put guns in people's hands and things like that, things just get kind of crazy. So anyway, I think about where I was, right, in terms of feeling feminine and femininity, right? You talk about a nervous system. You talk about a sense of feeling safe, feeling a sense of ease, right, in your environment. And I think about why for a very long time, I have not felt that same level of ease, right? And, I'm at a place in my life now where I'm okay, right? God's got me. I'm okay. And so I couldn't really seem to understand why was it that I was feeling this sense of unease, and I have been feeling it for a very long time. Now, like I said, I am a little bit older now. Life has lifed, right? Things have happened. So I'm not necessarily where I was, right? I'm not this carefree 18-year-old, right? I'm much older now. And so I think about this lack of safety that I have felt recently, and I think about all the factors that have come into play, right? I think I clocked this, I don't know, maybe a couple years ago, not that many years ago, but just more recently, right? That, women were becoming more and more competitive, right? I think when you start talking about conversations about like high value and, we don't really realize how the things that we hear, the things that we listen to, how it absolutely impacts the way we see ourselves, how it impacts the way we see one another. And so if you start talking about high value, right? And for the first time, you're not saying, hey, if someone is a millionaire or hey, if someone's a celebrity, right? Like you're putting very much like working class people who are in community with one another, and you're putting them against one another. There's going to be rivalry, right? And I don't think we realize as Black people, and obviously people don't care when you start talking about capitalism and content creation and making money, right? We don't care about what it is that we say and who we say it to and how it puts, how it changes the behavior of a person, right? And so everyone's trying to be a high value man, woman. And that starts to put and plant seeds in the minds of people, right? You're coming out, you're talking about hypergamy, you're talking about all these different things, right? Things that Black people don't have access to, right? For historical reasons. And it's going to create a very hostile environment among the people who are within that community and who are within that environment, right? And so I do think that there has been a huge shift in the ways in which Black women have been related to within the Black community, more specifically. Now, I'm not going to say in totality, right? Because I do think if I had to say, out of 5 or maybe 1 in 4, maybe 2, no, I say like maybe 1 in 4, right? Not everybody thinks that way. Not everybody degrades Black women in that way, right? Not everybody sees Black women in that way. This is all so relatively new, right? And I think that we have to, that's why I was given the context about previous relationships, right? And so anyway, I think about why I have felt so unsafe. And when you think about, depending on where you live geographically, right, you're talking about the gentrification, which is sweeping the real estate in many different communities, but predominantly Black and brown communities, right, minority communities. And you start talking about the demolition of like buildings and, how sidewalks are broken up and construction and just all these different things. Well, it's really hard to feel safe when you're walking down the street in that type of environment, right? And so for me, in my city, there was this really, really huge shift in construction and gentrification, right? Black people were being displaced. And when I go out into the world, obviously it's a small town, but like just by and large, there's not a lot of Black people who are outside. And I've noticed this because I used to live in the city, right? So there is one aspect of it. The other aspect of it is that if there are Black people in the city, they are, descendants of the crack era, literally, right? So they are homeless people. There are people who are on drugs. And so when you're walking in these communities, you don't actually feel safe. You feel alert. You feel on guard, right? You can't look around and see, a Black man who is clean and who, you know what I mean? Who is maybe put together or safe, or, I don't want to say safe because that's a big projection, but we'll just say like more put together, more, you don't have that. And so when you're living in these environments geographically where Black people are they're displaced, where there is an economic disadvantage, right? We are just dealing with something very serious. And so I think when you start talking about Black women and femininity being, right, femininity, being defined as ease, I think we are very far from that. And I think it's due to environmental reasons. And I think something I've always kind of grieved is just not leaving my city, right? I didn't want to be that person. And obviously, life and environment, all these different things are kind of at play at this point. But I do grieve never leaving my city, because I do believe that if I had went to like DC or, maybe even New York post-pandemic, when I wanted to go back in like 2020, I think it would be completely different. I think even if I had moved to Chicago, right? And so when I see Black people online and there's all these Black people, right? And they are, aware and culturally aware, right? They're knowledgeable. They may know who they are, all these different things, right? Like I just think you're in for a completely different experience, communal experience, cultural experience, versus being in spaces where there's, poverty and there's gentrification, there's a lack of education, right? For a myriad of reasons, whether it's segregation, whether it's low expectations, whatever, right? A lack of resources, economic deprivation, like there's just so much, right? And so I just think that that's something we don't really take into consideration, because when we talk about femininity and we see Black women out in the world doing things, right, it's always people who are in environments where they do feel safe and they do feel supported and there are enough resources. And we don't talk enough about the Black women who unfortunately are not in those environments, right? And there's a vast majority of us who are not. And so by and large, that's absolutely going to impact how you show up, right? If you are not feeling safe in the environment around you, you don't have time to be lolly-dolly, right? And that then translates to what we have today, right? We have a lot of Black women who kind of just go to the opposite extreme and think that the solution is just to put themselves into white spaces, into model, the behavior, the mannerisms, right? The attitudes, the beauty routines of white women, right? And that is not the case. That is not true at all, right? But when you start talking about the work of advocacy, and community organizing in regards to our communities to get the resources that we need to bring about that sense of community, to talk about mental health and all these different things, right? You're talking about masculinity, right? And that's something that we don't really find attractive, right? We all want to kind of escape the issues of the Black community. And I think that's in part why we don't really get anywhere. We don't really have any progress, right? Too many of us are really just trying to paint over, right, what is a very big, heavy, real, systemic barrier to our well-being and our happiness, right? And so it's easier to just say, I'm just going to kind of cosplay as a white woman, or I'm going to kind of adopt the type of patriarchal attitude as a white man, and I'm going to push, and I'm going to do all these things, than it is to say, we got to kind of talk about what's going on in our communities, and we got to talk about why we're not feeling safe and why we are being displaced, and we're socially isolated from one another, and our communities are you walk outside and there's destruction, right? And you're talking about trash, right? You're talking about concrete issues, right? You're talking about gentrification and many Black people being placed further out in the suburbs, right, where there really is no sense of community, right? And so I think it's a bigger issue. And I think when you start talking about femininity, I do think just structurally and historically, there's always been barriers that have kept Black women outside of feeling safe within their environments. And I do think that, socially, we're being socialized to continue to keep Black women in that state of survival and, feeling unprotected. And it's perpetual. So I don't think by and large that Black women are not inherently feminine. I think that Black women are unsafe. And I think that our environments are unstructured, unregulated, and unsupported, underfunded. And I think that's 100% going to impact how we show up. And so I think we need to start having more conversations about, where we are and where the vast majority of us are geographically, because not everybody is in LA or New York. And we don't have to talk about the reasons why, right? Some people went to college. Some people made better choices, right? We don't have to really get into why. We don't have to get into blaming, pushing, shoving, or any of that, right? But I do think that it's time that we start to give a voice to the vast majority of us and those of us who want to be heard. Peace.